Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where today I think we're going to get into a topic that is very much at the heart of a debate that is going on right now between different aspects of culturally right-wing people, different aspects of what serves in a lot of ways at the as an impetus to a debate, a disagreement amongst many so-called populist right and a more traditionalist right. And I'm going to use an article by Sohrab Ahmari, who is one of the leaders in the so-called New Right. What I would argue is a sort of perspective on economic issues that in a lot of ways is a catalyst to why this podcast exists, and certainly a source of inspiration for those like myself who feel deeply called to defending a free and virtuous society. And I believe the perspective that Sohrab and other people in his camp have taken is a lot of the motivation behind this call. Now, I do want to say something quickly before I dig too deep into the topic at hand. I like Sohrab Ahmari, and I can't really explain it. He doesn't know me personally. I don't know him personally. I know quite a few people who do know him, and it's entirely possible that I'm wrong in my assessment, but I think that I would like him from a lot of things I've heard. I follow him, his writing. I think it's part of my quest for intellectual honesty to know what others are saying that are in a camp that I'm in somewhat, staunch disagreement with when it pertains to certain key things we're going to talk about. And when I say I don't think he would like me, I suppose there's a possibility I'm wrong there, but much of what he's dedicated his life to at this time are things that he would disagree with me on. And so perhaps he would be able to separate the personal and the ideological the way that I try to. I don't know. But I do know this. There's something about him that I think differently about than some of the others who I believe are often performative, dishonest, exaggerative, and looking and also willing to associate with kind of silly things for a enemy of my enemy is my friend type of play. And I gotta say, Sohrab doesn't suffer a lot of the foolishness that others do. He's been really great about critiquing some of the footsie stuff that takes place with some of the right on anti-Semitism, and some people who are economically populist like he is, but then get culturally silly, whether it's kinism or racism or anti-Semitism. Sohrab pushes back on that, which I admire, and I just generally have observed in him a sort of cadence that I am fond of, and again, that authenticity I think is important. And that's not to belittle the fact that there are disagreements. And like I said, I think there are disagreements that would cause him to not like me very much. But today I want to be able to highlight, and he helped do this in a recent article he published at unheard.com. The link to this article is in our show notes. He helped to isolate where I think a lot of the source of disagreement is. But let me, in the interest of not remotely straw manning, set the table for what Sohrab's basic, the thrust of his argument is in this new piece. The name of the article is "How the Right Sold Out. They Repeated the Left's Mistakes." And what he is saying is that first, he does a very good assessment and I think accurate critique of wokeism. He points out that far from being a utopian worldview, it's a very pessimistic one. And he calls out the hypocrisy, as I've done many times, from some of the big companies that were most guilty of some of the most silly and somewhat indefensible wokish behavior during peak insanity for self-flagellation, for what I have often called Pharisaical virtue signaling. Those are my words. The self-flagellation is his word, but a very descriptive one. And he uses American Express, CVS as examples of companies that he thinks went overboard in indicting themselves for racist behavior, yet then would not engage in, and I'm quoting him here, interest rate capping interest rates, antitrust, other tangible reforms. So the theme he's going for here is that a lot of corporate America was hypocritical in engaging leftism and did it for the purpose of not having to go into other economic sensibilities. And I would say that there's a big part of this that's correct, and a big part that I'm going to get to that is the heart of our disagreement. He is most certainly right that wokeness was a prop for institutional power. I've long claimed that wokeism, DEI, and ESG were they basically existed as penance for the sin of making money. That corporate America, as long as they played along with certain culturally Marxist tropes, got a hall pass for what has really historically been the unforgivable sin of corporate America, which is the profit motive. And I think that there, you can call it greenwashing or profit washing or what have you. But what Sohrab does is not just rightly critique this element of the left, but he goes on to say that the online right is doing the same thing, and particularly the online populist right, which in a lot of ways Sohrab would be aligned with, but not in this, because he disapproves of when the right is basically right now okay with oligarchy and corporate power, that previously they were disapproving of it when big tech and big banks were aligned with the cultural left, but that now, since Elon Musk bought Twitter and some other moves of the last couple of years, he feels that the right has decided to let the oligarchs be, and that people like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Musk are getting a pass. And I think there's a little bit of fairness in the critique, to the point where he says a lot of these online right bros were kind of a cheap date. They were happy to see edgy and spicy stuff online, particularly Twitter, as good enough, even when there was racism or anti-Semitism thrown in. And I think Sorab's right to call out that outrageous behavior. But I think that where he goes astray is actually the heart of the disagreement we'd have. It's not a secret. It's not a mistake. It's a really explicit and quite transparent source of philosophical disagreement. I think he's right to point out that the right compromised or backed down around some easy cultural victories. But where I believe he's substantially wrong is in the diagnosis of the underlying problem and the go forward solution to the problem. And this daylight isn't new, and it shouldn't be shocking. I don't really think what I'm about to say is very profound in highlighting it, but it's the heart of the matter, and so that's what I want to do in the interest of fair debate. I believe the irreconcilable view of the world that Sohrab and I have comes down to his view of solutions being embedded, what he sees as a problem in the culture with corporate power is because of markets, because of profits. And he concludes, and by the way, specifically because of capital. His closing line is, and again, I'm quoting here word from word, not to put too fine a point on it. Capital is happy to grant your pronoun request and equally happy to throw Roman salutes, so long as wages and unions are kept down and antitrust regulators are brought to heel. This is the real point he's making, is that capital would play along with the left, pronouns, would play along with what he's calling the right, Roman salutes, which is the kind of wacky online bro behavior, but that what they most want to avoid is actually having to pay fair wages, pursue, and he talked earlier about these tangible reforms of higher wages, caps on interest rates, unionization, etc. And so I think that, first of all, the fundamental disagreement about capital is capital does no such thing. Capital is an inanimate object that is owned, used, and driven by people, people with agency. And yes, Sohrab is 100% right if he were to say that many people use left-wing insanity and racist memes as transactional conveniences towards their profit-making memes. But what he proposes as a go-forward solution is for unions and regulators, that somehow they are devoid of temptations, conflicts, corruption. Sohrab has never been wrong, or nor has any other critic of markets, to point out that markets are tainted by sin. The strong left-wing totalitarian approach that is, I think, utopian, dangerous, and I'm almost sure Sohrab would say he agrees with this critique, is that they fail to recognize the same taint of sin and corruption in state power that in fact is more magnified because of their monopoly on violence and Lord Acton's warning that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And therefore, the more statist solutions have always been problematic, even as one recognizes that there are things within markets that will go astray. But what Sohrab has is a strong heart for workers. And I promise you, that is not the heart of our disagreement. I do not reject his solutions of unionization, mandatory wages, federally imposed, greater regulatory apparatus. I do not reject the regulatory state, antitrust laws, because he's pro-worker, I'm anti-worker. I reject them because I am pro-worker. And I promise you that what we both want is a better environment in the context of profit making and growth and prosperity that honors the dignity of the human being. He refers to Amazon warehouses as Dickensian. And Dickens' imagery was powerful in the 19th century. I, much like when people say that NFL players today are treated as slaves, I think it's an offense to 19th century reality. The Amazon warehouses are most certainly not Dickens-esque in any way, shape, or form. But it's an effective rhetorical argument. But I do not believe that the workers are being oppressed. And Sohrab, I think, legitimately does. And I respect his heart for workers. I hope he would respect mine, but I will tell you that I believe the solutions he proposes make things worse for workers, not better. And I believe that this is so firmly taught in history that it disappoints me we're relitigating it today. A very famous measure, first of all, real serious desire to see higher wages for manufacturers, for blue collar workers in the 1930s resulted in trying to codify this in the Davis-Bacon Act. And it did put upward pressure for wages for construction workers. Herbert Hoover was pretty successful in driving manufacturing wages up 10%. An awful lot of firms couldn't afford it, and it led to joblessness. And in fact, unemployment hit, as we know, 25%. Now, some could say this is a depression era that doesn't necessarily speak to a normative, but first of all, this is before this is before these conditions worsened, and in fact, I would argue exacerbated them. But if we wanted to take 1930s examples out altogether, just simply because we felt that they were too susceptible to being exceptions to the rule instead of the rule, I wouldn't agree with the argument. I think that they're actually stories, they're examples in history that prove my point, not exceptions to any other point. But be that as it may, there is no precedent in which the state imposition of trying to force wages higher did not hurt workers. And I believe that his examples he uses in the article of, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they're just simply trying to avoid bad behavior from banks. And, he alluded approvingly to credit card caps, which is a topic I've addressed in earlier episodes of this podcast. Um, there likely isn't a solution to this disagreement between Sohrab Ahmari and myself, because I firmly believe that history is abundantly clear that unions and regulators are susceptible to significant corruption, and that in markets you have a better regulating force, still the need for prudential regulation, but that expanding state power and expanding unionization has not made working conditions better, and in fact has done unspeakable damage to auto workers, to airline workers, and these other companies that have held on to an era of unionization, all the while workers in very lucrative domains have achieved wonderful working conditions and real wage growth and balance sheet wealth that have never been susceptible to unionization, often in the technology sector, but finance as well. So I don't think we can solve this in this podcast right now. I don't think Sohrab and I can solve it over a long coffee, but I want you as listeners to understand that there is a lot of truth to the accusation that corporate America used left-wing cultural objectives to sort of paper over the fact that many would be critical of their business model, and that right now the right is prone to falling for something very similar. I believe the need of the hour is more profit-making enterprises, less relationship between the state and these private actors that then enhances their potential for corruption, because you have then wed their profit-making abilities to state power. And that is where you get oligarchy. That is where you get corruption. That is where you get cronyism that undermines markets and ultimately does the type of damage that I disagree with, that I am very confident Sohrab would disagree with. Believing that a pro-worker agenda requires greater unionization is not borne out in history. And it is certainly not the case that a particular view on wage controls dictated by DC, which is a form of price controls, the price of labor, is a way to affect a better outcome. I respect Sohrab's integrity and his sincerity in believing that it does. I sincerely believe it does not. And in fact, that workers suffer from a greater regulatory apparatus. They suffer from joblessness, that when you price certain elements of construction and manufacturing out, you move jobs offshore, you incentivize other alternative means of productivity, and that in a comprehensive, heartfelt, but also thoughtful approach to a pro-worker agenda, I think the solutions Sohrab proposes in his worldview are wrong. We have a lot in common on the cultural elements that we're up against, and I will never back down in critiquing corporate America for bouncing back and forth between the cultural trend of the day as a means of being left alone. But the real problem is not that they are doing this to avoid wage growth, unionization, and regulatory oversight. What the need of the hour is liberty and virtue juxtaposed and evidenced in corporate America. And when one says you're never going to get that in corporate America, but you will get it in unions, you will get it with regulators, you will get it with Washington, D.C., I believe that's the fundamental problem, a problem of knowledge and a problem of incentives. So this is a big topic. It's a thoughtful article that Sohrab Ahmari wrote. Again, the link in the show notes. But I would encourage everyone to understand that you can be pro-worker and that you need not embrace state solutions such as wage controls and forced unionization. In fact, I would argue that it is much more pro-worker to be on my side of these issues. Thank you, as always, for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record. Thank you to National Review for hosting. And please reach out with questions anytime. Look forward to being with you again in a couple of days. Take care.